Babatunde, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and thank you for joining this webinar. Today's webinar has been brought to you by the SPE technical sections, 3 technical sections, the plug and abandonment technical section, well integrity technical section, and the methane technical section. This afternoon, we have Dr. Maria Ozuk, who is a research fellow in quantification, measurement, report, and verification of greenhouse gas emissions at Oxford University. She belongs to the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, specializing in the quantification, measurement, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas emissions. She earned a PhD between 2020 and 2024 in chemical engineering from Queen Mary University in London. Her doctoral research focused on bridging the gap between scientific research, technologies, policies to monitor and mitigate methane emissions from industrial sites, including biogas plants. In 2022, she joined the Environmental Defense Fund as a consultant, where she conducted research on coal mine methane and methane policies within the context of LNG trading. Maria began her professional career at the Polish Ministry of the Environment, where she played an active role in the preparations and proceedings of the COP19 and CMP9 as a member of the Polish presidency team. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Babatunde, and thank you very much for this kind introduction and invitation to join this event. I'm still, I see my slides, that's perfect. Okay, so before I start the presentation itself, I have just a couple of remarks that I hopefully will provide a little bit of explanation and thinking behind EU Methane Regulation. There is quite a lot of details, but I think by providing these introductory remarks, it will be just a little bit easier to focus on the things that really matter. So as you can see on the first slide, Methane Regulation entered into force in August 2024, which means that we are nearly almost 2 years into the implementation process. And just as a reminder, it covers methane emissions associated with 3 fossil fuels, so crude oil, natural gas, and coal. What is really interesting about the structure of the obligations under the regulation is that it has domestic dimension and international dimension. So under the domestic dimension, we have new obligations for the EU producers and operators in the EU regarding the measurement, reporting, and verification of methane emissions, leak detection and repair, and also venting and flaring restrictions. Now, in the second part, refers to methane emissions associated with fossil fuels which are imported into the EU, so not produced in the EU, but imported into the EU. And here we have the methane intensity standard, as well as the transparency tools, because the idea is that the methane emissions that will be reported by the operators will be in some shape or form publicly accessible through a transparency database. So that's the general idea behind the regulation. When we talk about the implications of this regulation for the offshore producers, we need to distinguish between the impact for the producers that are in the EU and also the producers outside of the European Union that export their fossil fuels into the EU or they think about exporting to the EU. So the direct impact will be only on the producers operating in the EU. So for instance, if you are producers operating in the North Sea or in the Black Sea, like Romania, we have these prescriptive requirements on MRV, leak detection and repair, venting and flaring, and also obligations regarding inactive and abandoned wells. And that will be the second part of my presentation. However, in the first part, I will focus on those provisions that have indirect impact on producers in third countries that export fossil fuels into the EU. So here we have examples of countries like Norway, the UK, the US, also countries like Qatar or Angola. So in that case, those producers will be covered under the import requirements. And I will talk about it in the first part of this presentation. I wanted to make two remarks as these are important and sometimes get a little bit mixed. So we have the production. It's important to mention that import standard refers to production level emissions only. It doesn't cover the entire supply chain. And that legal obligation is on the EU importers only. So there is no new legal obligation directly for third country producers and exporters. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Now, again, if we compare the domestic dimension and the international dimension, I think what is particularly new for the EU producers is that for the first time, the regulation introduces single regulatory regime for onshore and offshore assets, which is quite unusual because until now, the offshore assets were usually under a specific regime due to the differences in the operating conditions. But this time in the regulation, we have just one regime. There are new requirements for inactive, plugged and abandoned wells, which will need to be included under the publicly available inventory of such wells. And one thing that I think is particularly interesting is that competent authorities, so the institutions that are responsible for the enforcement of these provisions, will have some flexibility in how they implement these provisions. Now, for the exporters and importers, what is really important is that the import requirements are not, they do not enter into force on exactly the same date. They build on each other between 2025 and 2030. But as of 2027, 2028, the EU importers will need to include these new requirements into their sourcing strategies. It also means that the access to the EU market will become increasingly conditioned based on the access to transparent emission data, that operators that have low emissions and they can prove it potentially have commercial advantage. One observation from the first months of the implementation process, especially when it comes to the import requirements, they became highly politicized and subject to debate, which I think will have quite important impact on how this regulation will be implemented. So this is just for the introductory remarks that hopefully will provide a little bit of explanation. And now I will delve a little bit more into the details regarding the import requirements. So as you can see, and I already mentioned that, so the import requirements build upon each other between 2025 and 2030, and we have three major groups of obligations. So the first obligation is the so-called Annex 9 reporting. The second is MRV equivalence, or the obligation to prove that when oil, gas, or coal is produced, those emissions are monitored, reported, and verified in line with the standards set by the methane regulation. As you can see, this requirement enters into force as of 1st of January 2027, but in practice, it means that from this date, the operators will need to measure their emissions, report, verify their emissions, but those reports will be due only in mid-2028. Now, the last step is methane intensity reporting in 2028 and the demonstration by 2030. So as you can see, the import standard in the full form will be binding as of 2030 only. So there is still quite some time to go, but we already see that there are some challenges related to the implementation of some of the provisions. So Annex 9, I think it's relatively easy and non-controversial as majority of this information is publicly available. Now, for the MRV equivalence, it means that the EU importers will need to identify the producers in third countries, which may be easy if there is a long-term contract signed between those parties, but becomes more problematic with complex supply chains. And the second part of requirement is to demonstrate this MRV equivalence which sometimes could be quite challenging. With methane intensity reporting and demonstration, I will not be able to comment on that because we are still waiting for the methodology and the thresholds to be specified by European Commission in the secondary legislation. So this slide just is a demonstration of what type of information is expected to be provided under Annex 9 reporting. I will not, I will not comment on that. But as I mentioned, it is usually considered as not controversial. Now, for the MRV equivalence, what does it actually mean? We have two potential ways of compliance, and we can distinguish between company level and country level. So at the company level, the companies have choice between either following Article 12 of the regulation combined with third-party verification, or to achieve the highest level of the so-called Oil and Gas Methane Partnership or OGMP reporting, so level 5, again combined with third-party verification. Alternative route is the so-called country-level equivalence, where potentially all operators operating in one country could be subject to this obligation. So in that case, if, for instance, domestic requirements are considered as equivalent with methane regulation, they won't need to do more than just the domestic requirements. So in that case, it's a potentially attractive way to comply. However, currently this option is unavailable. This is because we are still waiting for the General Implementing Act setting the rules for and procedure for this country-level equivalence. So the way things are right now, the only way to comply with regulation is for it's a company-level equivalence, which means especially for the operators that are not or outside of the EU, the option that seems to be the most attractive is joining OGMP 2.0. And just a little bit of explanation regarding the OGMP. Again, it's a voluntary reporting initiative. There are 5 levels of reporting, with the level 5 combining elements of source level and site level measurements, which are considered as scientifically the most robust and also the most accurate in terms of the measurement of emissions. One important remark, especially for companies having a choice between Article 12 and OGMP, is that despite it was intended for them to be more or less the same, they are not exactly the same. And I think one of the differences between them that is worth highlighting is materiality. And so there is no materiality thresholds under regulation, which is not the case in OGMP. Under OGMP, there are materiality requirements. So in that case, regulation is more stringent than OGMP. And third-party verification. So under OGMP, there is element of measurement, monitoring, and reporting, but there is no third-party verification which is required under the regulation. And regulation requires the verification to be at the reasonable level of assurance, which is the highest level of assurance that verifiers can use. So it's important to keep that in mind. So I talked quite a lot about the obligations, but I think it's really important to think what does it mean for the operators and for their behavior. As you can see, even though the primary responsible party is the EU importer, they would need to include these new requirements into the contractual provisions. And there is a distinction between the requirements for new and renewed contracts. So those signed after the regulation entered into force, or for methane intensity reporting and thresholds, it's another date. So in that case, we have firm requirements. But for the contracts that are signed before that date, the operators would need to importers would need to undertake all reasonable efforts. So it's in a way it's much softer requirement. One important thing to mention is penalties. So in case of non-compliance, there are financial penalties and also reputational penalties, because information regarding the assigned penalties will be publicly available. There is no ban on non-compliant LNG or other fossil fuels, so theoretically it's still possible to import them into the EU. However, potentially there will be some additional costs related to penalties that will need to be paid. One important thing to note is that penalties will be set by member states. So there is no one uniform level of penalties across the EU. It will be subject to member states' decisions. These slides just show you the implementation process and enforcement process, but I think the key message here is that even though regulation was adopted at the EU level, now the implementation is up to the member states, and each member state was responsible to appoint at least one competent authority or the institution responsible for the implementation. Apart from that, member states, in majority of cases, need to adopt implementing legislation, national legislation, that actually enable the competent authorities to fulfill their role. And apart from that, to set penalty regimes under this national legislation. This is the slide that just shows you the main tasks of competent authorities. I think apart from what you can expect already, so enforcement and oversight with the possibility to carry out inspections, handle complaints and impose penalties, there are also some interesting requirements regarding regulatory flexibility, although the flexibility is only allowed in case of domestic requirements. This is because it's just to ensure that the way the regulation is enforced is more harmonized at the EU level. And then when it comes to the implementation itself, as I mentioned, for the member states, there were two major decisions to be taken. First, to designate competent authority, and then to establish penalty regimes. So member states had precisely 6 months since the entry into force of the regulation for the designation of competent authorities, and 12 months to publish penalty regimes. What is really interesting and what actually happened is that not all member states appointed competent authorities, but the only remaining member states are not, let's say, the major EU importers. But the European Commission decided to initiate the infringement procedure. In a way, it is a way for the European Commission to ensure that member states comply with regulation and appoint competent authorities. However, despite the delays with the establishing penalty regimes, there is no infringement procedures opened against those member states. I think the implication is that actually Commission recognizes that member states need more time for this discussion regarding penalty regimes. And in some cases, the penalty regimes are actually combined with the domestic enabling legislation. So that's why also it's one of the reasons why it's taking more time. Just to conclude this part of presentation, I think there are 4 major points when it comes to the implementation of the regulation and what have been learned from this couple of months of early implementation process. So what we see is that despite this polarization and politicization of discussion around methane emission regulation implementation, it looks like it will be delayed but not necessarily derailed altogether. The second thing is just the tension that exists between member states and the industry regarding the implementation gaps. It looks like for member states it is still important to keep this flexibility. Member states also and competent authorities have different, let's say, views regarding the responsibility of EU importers for potential non-compliance of producers and exporters. And I think this tension leads to the emergence of the evolving regulatory regime. What it means is that some compliance solutions that will be acceptable right now may not be acceptable in the future, as the, let's say, the perception and also the way the competent authorities want to see the process to evolve will change over time. Last but not least, it requires, the regulation itself requires a shift in current regulatory practices when it comes to the verification of emissions in third countries and also the penalty regimes, because they need to take into account not only the infringement itself, but also ensure that it does not endanger security of supply. I will provide more information regarding this early implementation process in the new publication that will be published quite soon. But that brings me to the domestic part, which I think was the key focus actually of today's webinar. So I will start with obligations regarding inactive wells, temporarily plugged wells, and permanently plugged and abandoned wells. So that's Article 18. As you can see, so this is the new obligation to identify those wells, to quantify methane emissions, and also to mitigate or remediate if material emissions are found. And again, there is a timeline for member states and for the operators to comply with these requirements. So by 5th of August 2025, it was to establish and to make publicly available the inventory of such wells. The second obligation is to, by 5th of May 2026, to submit reports with information of methane emissions quantification and pressure monitoring for all inactive and temporarily plugged wells. Those reports will need to be repeated annually and verified by third-party verifiers. There is a potential way to let's say, to switch from these requirements if there is no emissions identified for 5 years for onshore and 3 years for offshore assets. So in that case, the quantification obligations do not apply anymore. But in case material emissions are identified, there is a need to undertake necessary measures to remediate with the need to establish a special mitigation plan. The general rule is that it's responsibility for the operators, but in case operators are not, member states cannot identify the operators, it will be the responsibility for member states. I just wanted to highlight that this requirement also includes the offshore exemption. So it is up to the competent authorities to exempt oil and gas wells located at certain water depth from the quantification or remediation requirements. I think what is very important here is just good cooperation with the competent authority on the part of the operator, and also trying to understand what type of evidence is needed in order to get this exemption. And apart from that, we have also obligations regarding leak detection and repair and venting and flaring. And just very briefly regarding LDAR, this is Article 14, and this is one of the most cumbersome requirements in the regulation. But general requirement is that by the 5th of May 2025, the operators had to submit their first LDAR program to competent authorities. The EU Methane Emissions Regulation requirements specify the way the operators should be doing the LDAR programs. So it specifies the frequency of inspections, it specifies the detection limits, repair and replacement limits, and also timelines and record keeping. I emphasizing this point because I think what we observed is that until now the operators in the EU were of course doing the LDAR, but they were doing it in very different ways. So let's say the idea here is to make it more harmonized across member states, but also across different types of assets. There's also requirements regarding the subsea components and when the repair and replacement should happen. There are also requirements regarding the need to access or to check whether the requirement was or repair was successful. So all those, let's say, requirements are very, very specific but there is also a possibility of getting offshore exemption for certain types of wells. But again, this is subject to assessment of the competent authorities. There's one point here that is still missing. It's the minimum detection limits and techniques for LDAR surveys should be, let's say, specified by European Commission in the Implementing Act. We are still waiting for this act to be officially adopted. It is my understanding that it should happen sometime in 2026. And that leads me to venting and flaring restrictions. The idea here is just to ensure that venting and routine flaring do not happen anymore, so they are completely banned, except in specific 11 cases specified by the regulation, and also emergency and malfunction. It also means that there are specific requirements regarding the reporting of venting and flaring events to competent authorities with both annual reports and ad hoc notification in case of large releases. In a way, the way to understand those requirements is that the regulation creates a form of hierarchy for the operators. So they first need to minimize venting, for instance, by looking for alternative equipment that do not vent or minimizes the venting, then to capture and use gas where it's possible. Then if it's not possible to flare, and venting becomes a practice of a last resort. There's also requirements regarding the monitoring of flare stacks or other combustion devices. They need to, also there are requirements regarding the installation of those components. So they need to be equipped with auto-igniter or continuous pilot burner, and they have to have at least 99% destruction and removal efficiency, which is a very, very high level compared to, let's say, 92% usually assumed by the IEA. And that brings me to the last slide. I understand that it was very, very heavy and packed presentation, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of points regarding what is really important and what we should take away from this presentation. The methane regulation entered into force in 2024. It introduces new obligations on operators regarding the monitoring, reporting, and verification and mitigation of emissions. It's really important to emphasize that it's the first global methane policy that targets imported emissions. There are different regulatory approaches for domestic and imported emissions. And what is really interesting that the regulation introduces a single regulatory regime for onshore and offshore production. When it comes to the implementation process, what is really interesting is that there is much more flexibility allowed for the domestic part, which is much more prescriptive. But in that case, again, it relies on the cooperation between operator and competent authority and the type of, let's say, evidence that competent authorities will require from operators. There are exemptions possible for offshore components and wells. When it comes to the importer requirements, again, the current focus is on finalizing the work on compliance solutions for complex supply chains and penalty regimes. And I think that's, let's say, the key focus right now. But the early implementation experience points that it will be rather an evolving regulatory regime and with a very important role of the network of competent authorities. So this is the type of, let's say, of cooperation framework between the competent authorities in member states and Commission in order to harmonize the implementation of methane regulation. For the time being, the network focused mostly on the importer requirements, which also suggests to us that competent authorities will have more leeway and there will be less focus on harmonization for the domestic requirements. With that, I will conclude my presentation. We are exactly halfway through the webinar, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. May I take this opportunity to introduce our panelists and ask them to, say a word about their profile. I call on Martin to please introduce himself, and then we'll go to P.E. Vincent. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm Martin Wulfsa. I studied geology and received a PhD from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And then I worked for a couple of years in the industry, mostly as an exploration geologist. And since 2016, I'm working for the Geological Survey of the Netherlands. part of research institute TNO, and I work for a department which is advising our ministry on oil and gas licensing issues. And last year we've organized a symposium in Utrecht where I met Pierre-Edouard and Maria. And it was organized together with our Sea Research Institute on Texel, the Netherlands Institute of Seagoing Research, and also with the regulator, our State Supervision on Mines. And I'm especially involved a couple of years already in especially leaking offshore wells. I think I'll keep it.
Thank you very much, Martin. P, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Babatunde, and thank you, Maria, for accepting to repeat the excellent presentation you gave in Utrecht. So I'm Pierre-Edouard Vincent. I'm currently principal engineer with the wells risk management team at Total Energies, and also serve in various positions with several technical sections at SP, with a focus on wells, more specifically with the P&A, TS, and the WITS. Thank you.
I guess we'll move to the next bit. P.
Sure. So I think it's going to be a panel discussion between ourselves, and maybe I'll start with a specific question to Maria on you. So you mentioned materiality and the fact that there is a difference between EU MERs and OGMP 2.0. Do you want to expand a little bit on what that difference is? It's quite important.
For the specifics, I think it's better to consult the technical guidance documents of the OGMP, because I think it's specific. But I understand that there are two levels of materiality under the OGMP. So maybe just the concept of materiality, because I understand that materiality also sometimes appears in the framework for verifiers, but it doesn't mean exactly the same thing. So when we mean materiality in that context, it usually refers to whether you need to measure exactly all your emissions, or you need to measure some emissions above certain threshold. And under the OGMP 2.0, there is a materiality threshold. And there are actually two thresholds for the asset level and portfolio level. And so there is a specific percentage that let's say provides for so it means that you need to focus only on your material emissions. So before above certain threshold, you don't need to measure all your emissions at asset level, and also you don't need to measure all your emissions at portfolio level, which indicates that you need to focus only on those assets within your portfolio that are material. I don't remember, I think it was, if I remember correctly, 95% threshold, but I will need to double check it just to make sure that I do not mistake it. But yeah, the key importance is that there is let's say, there is this materiality threshold under OGMP, but for, let's say, for battery regulation, there is not such a requirement. Also, subsea emissions are not covered by OGMP, so those emissions do not need to be measured.
Yeah, Babatunde, maybe comments or questions, or Martin to Maria also? Or...
No, yeah, I mean, this is of part one of your presentation. And I think what Pierre-Edouard just said was on the same slide. And I was triggered by that you mentioned that LNG is not covered by the methane emission regulation. But I'm not sure if I understood rightly, because there were so many abbreviations stormed over our heads. So, and because also within the within the EU-US trade agreement we did, the US expects a lot of LNG to export to the EU. So can you comment a little bit on this? Because
Yeah, great question. And just to clarify it, the production part of LNG supply chain is covered by the regulation. But what I meant by on the slide is that LNG shipping is not covered in the regulation. And this is there is a logic behind that, because LNG shipping is already covered by the EU Emissions Trading Scheme and also Fuel EU Maritime. So those are separate regulations focusing on the decarbonization of maritime transport. So methane regulation focuses only on the upstream part, not the entire supply chain.
All right. Well, there was a lot of lawyer talk in this one. For me as a geologist, I need to hear this again. And may I continue with another question, Pierre-Edouard? But if you have
absolutely, Martin.
Yeah, because, well, I did a lot of research on leaking offshore wells. And I think there is some disproportionality in the EU regulation on this part. Like repairing a well which leaks above this threshold. And coming from the Netherlands, I like to mention that it is more or less the same threshold as one cow emits. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking at leaking cows on the seafloor. And then I was triggered that if a well has no owner anymore, that member state, and so the taxpayer will pay for the cost of repairing those wells. Did I also understood that rightly?
Yes, so this is the requirement under the regulation. Maybe what I wanted to emphasize is that, my research focuses on methane regulation, but I'm not part of European Commission, so I cannot comment on why exactly it's the case, or I cannot defend the provisions. So I think the right, institution to address any comments regarding feasibility of requirements is actually competent authority within member states or European Commission. As I can only explain what is in the regulation, but I have no power, to change it or to explain it, the exact thinking why it was the case or why it was decided this way. But maybe general, from the, how the provisions were developing in the past. So there was the research coming, especially from the US, with quite alarming, findings regarding the potential emissions from abandoned wells. And I think that inspired some of the provisions. Of course, we can now discuss whether it's accurate and whether it's okay to provide the same or to expect exactly the same from onshore assets and offshore assets. I think that's the subject to debate. But what I tried to, emphasize in my presentation is, despite these all obligations, there's quite a lot of flexibility provided in the regulation how it will be implemented. And again, it could be good, or it could be treated as a form of legal uncertainty. But I guess from the point of view of producers in the EU, especially with the requirements on the inactive wells, I think this is rather a good news that there is this flexibility that is foreseen in the regulation.
All right.
Thank you. Can I just do a follow-up question on that? I recall at the beginning of your presentation, you made mention of the fact that the EU Methane Emission Regulations has direct impact on those within the EU member state and also those who import from other countries, say in Asia or Africa, for example, as indirect impact. I just wonder, could you kind of talk us through the strategy by which the EU regulations hopes to be able to monitor this going forward? Because, those guys are not producing within the EU laws. So how do they intend to implement this?
Yeah, that's a good one. But again, so I think at least the idea behind the import standard is to put more obligations on the EU importers. So they need to comply. They potentially face the penalties for non-compliance. And the thinking is that they can use their buyers or purchasing power in order to somehow, I wouldn't say force, but let's say provide some incentives for the producers in order to comply with the regulation to minimize their methane emissions. That's the idea. So even though we have the requirements in the regulation, they need to be somehow translated into the contractual contracts, right? So that's really interesting dimension. Although I wouldn't say there is no precedence for that. If you remember, around 2020s, there was discussion regarding carbon neutral LNG, and some of the companies voluntarily, let's say, were marketing their LNG as with low methane emissions and with low, or in general, with low greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's one thing. When it comes to enforcement, I think that's where the challenge is. And again, I think those challenges has been identified, and now I think the focus is on thinking how to, let's say, how to ensure the compliance. So maybe from my conversations with competent authorities, I think what is really important to emphasize is that they focus more on ensuring that companies know how to comply and know what type of documents or evidence is needed. So that's why there is this focus on the compliance options for the complex supply chains, with potentially opening to some more flexible ways of compliance, like certification using based on more flexible chains of custody. And again, this is still subject to debate. But another point is to ensuring that competent authorities have actually tools to ensure that the exporters comply with the regulation. And here, I think one thing that is important is this third-party verification. So there's a very high requirement on verifiers. They need to be accredited by national accreditation bodies. So it's exactly the same requirement that is under the EU emissions trading system. And they need to ensure that, or they need to do the reasonable level of assurance. So there is a difference in the type of statement that the verifiers use for limited and reasonable level of assurance, but with reasonable, it is the highest standard, and also potentially there is, let's say, potentially more time consuming as well. There is a need for, let's say, extra evidence. It looks like the verifiers will have access to the emissions data from the producers, but I think the discussion now starts, whether the competent authorities should just accept third-party verification statements, or they should also have access to emission report. So I think that's subject to debate.
Like a peer review.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that is really interesting is also the regulation mentions the use of, let's say, the Mars monitoring or International Methane Emissions Observatory monitoring, so the use of satellites, which again may be quite attractive option for onshore assets and for very high releases for offshore, but it looks like, it is still the case that satellites are not able to, let's say, detect as low emissions from offshore areas as from onshore. So I think that's, let's say, that's the thinking, and also the dilemmas that are right now. But very good question.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have got, sorry, carry on, Martin, sorry.
Yeah, can you add to because we're discussing about to be compliant to this regulation. I missed, or maybe you did in your presentation, but there is a penalty, which I read which is 20% of turnover of a company. Is that still, can you discuss a little bit on this? And also, when the state is becoming the owner of an abandoned well, will that also apply then for a state?
Okay, interesting. Okay, so first 20%. So this is the amount that industry likes to raise a lot, but I think we need to provide a little bit of a context. So the regulation specifies this 20% as a maximum level of penalties. So member states cannot set higher penalties than this 20%, but it does not specify minimum level of penalties. So again, so that's the absolute maximum level. If you do not comply with regulation, potentially if you do not comply more than once, if you do not cooperate with the competent authority, if it's your only fault, there is no third party involved. So that's absolutely the worst case that you can imagine. Now, I wanted to highlight that companies focus on that a lot, but penalty regimes are grounded into the national legislation. And financial penalties are just one form of penalties. There will be also, first of all, like some form of notification, but some member states foresee also the criminal responsibility, which I would say it's much more potentially damaging than financial penalties. So I think that's really, really interesting. And again, that's where the uncertainty for the operators come, because those penalty regimes potentially can vary a lot. But that's why let's say the role of the network of competent authorities is so important, that the penalty regimes are harmonized, because we cannot let's say have the situation, especially for imports, that would be quite damaging. Now, for that's a good question regarding the obligation, because that would imply that somehow competent authorities, which in many cases are just ministries responsible within the governments responsible for the enforcement of regulation, would need to self-impose penalties. I don't think it will work like that. In that case, we will see what will happen. Theoretically, there is an option for, let's say, if there is potentially an NGO that observes this and that there is a problem with abandoned wells and member states does not do anything, there is an option to open, let's say, to use the legal way, to complain first with competent authority, and potentially legal systems should provide some form of responsibility also for the government using the national legal system, so going to national courts. That's what may happen. I don't think it will happen. I think that's really the worst case. But in principle, what you are saying is right. If there is no, let's say, operator that is responsible, that will be the member state's responsibility. Although, as you can see on the slide, there is also some special, in case of member states with a lot of abandoned wells, potentially countries like Romania, there will be more time and potentially slightly more, let's say, more flexibility for those member states.
Yeah, because Romania is one of the first oil provinces in the world and has thousands of wells. So that's for the audience to explain why you mentioned Romania.
Yeah, and I know from the people working on the ground that it's really challenging because there is no inventory. Typically, there is no inventory, and even if in member states there are different practices, but many companies with such abandoned wells, they really need to go into the field, cut all the bushes that already covered those wells, and try to find them and localize them. So it is a quite significant challenge. But also, when you think about it from the, let's say, public health point of view, I think it would be useful to have this information now, that regarding, at least to know how many wells there are, whether there are some emissions associated with those wells, because potentially it is still a source of emissions.
Yeah, in principle, the methane emission regulation is a good tool, I think, but it is about the disproportionality of certain things in this ruling.
Maria, if I can ask that, if you were part, or at least you followed, the preparation and then release of guidelines or regulations in the last, say, 5 years, or maybe even before that, if you had an interest in the topic, I'm a bit curious with how we got to where we are. Both with the OGMP and with the EU MER, and how those, between the two, there can be some gaps, as you highlighted. And then I'll have a question at another level on LRP also, and the philosophy that is quite different between some countries who use the LRP principle versus the EU that does not mention that word anywhere, unless I'm mistaken. So first question, the potential gaps, in OGMP 2.0 and the EU MER. What differences?
Okay, so apart from materiality, which we already discussed, so as we also covered differences in the scope of methane regulation and OGMP. So again, with this shipping part, right? It's not covered by methane regulation, but it's covered under OGMP. So companies that have emissions from LNG shipping also report those emissions to OGMP. We discussed that. We discussed third-party verification. So I think those let's say are the most important. But in principle, the only, let's say, voluntary reporting initiative that regulation refers to is OGMP 2.0. And why those gaps appeared? That's a very good question, but I think I'm not able. I won't be able to let's say address it fully. If you look at the early development, so the EU methane strategy back in 2020, then the proposal for EU methane regulation 2021. It's also the time when OGMP was, let's say, the works under OGMP were developing and were getting more and more intense. But I think OGMP is a very interesting tool because it's flexible on purpose. And there is a scientific reason for that, because we are still learning how to measure methane emissions, which, very well, is a very difficult type of emissions to measure. It's not visible to human eye. We need special type of equipment that we can measure. There have been tremendous, let's say, development over the last 10 years when it comes to the technologies that can be used. So the type of sensors that are available, also the type of platforms that we can use. Initially, people were using OGI cameras to detect and then to quantify methane emissions. Now they can use sensors mounted on the cars, on drones. They can use also satellites. So there have been tremendous growth in that aspect. But then there's also a question how much you need to measure, what's your sampling approach. And I think that's where we still struggle a lot. And the regulation was designed in a way to account for these challenges, right? To also, let's say, to not make it very strict when it comes to the MRV part in order that regulation evolves with OGMP. But I think the challenge here right now, especially from operators' point of view, is that the OGMP gives you the flexibility, but if you need to combine it with third-party verification, that's where your problems start, because verifiers need to have the set standard because they want to do verification in a very representative but also repeatable way, right? So that they have consistent results across different types of operators, across different types of geographies. And if you do not have the set types of rules, that becomes a little bit problematic. So I would say that's, let's say, it's just regulation was, let's say, modeled on OGMP, but it's just slightly different philosophy if you allow the companies to, let's say, experiment and to do different types of measurements and try to figure out how to do reconciliation. Whereas there is a difference if you have a regulation which should be very specific, because companies need to know what they are requested to do in order to comply with regulation, right? So I think that's, let's say, the challenge and why we are facing it right now. I hope it addresses the question.
Yeah, it kind of does. I can't help kind of wonder a bit how we got, especially with the focus on subsea, emissions and idle wells, because those are relatively easy to go back to and do some leak detection and measurements when they're onshore and not too old. But it still gets quite complicated when it's on the onshore and there are many wells. It's a known issue in some countries where there are literally millions of wells. Now, for the offshore part, of course, it's a lot more complicated to just go back to the wells, acquire data, and I'm a bit surprised that the first pass of EU regulations on methane went so far on subsea wells when a lot happened very recently. We're still learning on what's natural, what's not natural, how to deploy measurement equipment, etc. So I don't know what happened and how we got to this regulation when we had a gap in OGMP 2.0 for offshore, subsea sources, for instance.
Okay, I think there is no. Again, I was not involved in the negotiations between the Commission, the Council, and the European Parliament. But what I understood from the interviews that I conducted for the research, it is a little bit of political game, right? And because. Maybe one thing to remember is that, for instance, import requirements were not originally part of the proposal. They were added during the legislative process. And I think that's where the influence to the domestic part starts, because some, especially MEPs, treated some of the provisions under the domestic part, and they tried to make them very inflexible and to high standards, so that to get potentially a little bit more what they wanted in the import part. So this is part of, let's say, negotiating political game. And I understand, let's say, a little bit of a frustration, especially with offshore assets. But I think this is, let's say, one potential explanation why is it right now. The other potential explanation that I've heard is about claims made by some of the technology providers regarding how well they can measure emissions from offshore assets. That's potentially another factor that could have contributed. But again, this is just a loose theory. I'm not sure exactly why it was decided this way. I included one slide as a backup slide, but it's really interesting from the OGMP reporting for offshore assets specifically. There is a very interesting message that got a little bit hidden. So they made a comparison between the level 4 emissions and level 5 emissions for some types of onshore assets and offshore assets. What is really interesting is that typically in the academic literature, there is an, let's say, assumption that once you start to measure more, so you achieve level 5, your emission get typically higher, because potentially there are some emission sources that you do not include in your first round of or source level measurements or source level inventory. Whereas for the offshore assets, so it is still true for the majority for the assets from onshore, but for offshore, it was the opposite was true. So level 4 emissions were slightly higher. There was not the dramatic difference, but higher than level 5 emissions. And what does it mean? There are a couple of potential explanations that could vary across the operators, but it could be the case that, for instance, the emission factors that are currently used are conservative enough and even over conservative in a way that once you start to measure potentially also your activity data, you get to the conclusion that those emissions are actually lower. It could be also because the detection threshold for offshore assets or for offshore emissions are a little bit higher because we are measuring in different conditions. So again, it is still subject to, let's say, further investigation, but potentially it can also imply that emissions from offshore assets or some types of offshore assets could be lower. And that's really interesting, let's say, development, because usually it is assumed in the literature. Also, IEA made it clear in the methane tracker that Norway is one of the lowest, let's say, producers of gas. But it could be because it's Norway. It could be also because it's mostly offshore production. Would be very interesting to know how representative this claim would be across different geographies and different operators. But there is some, let's say, some evidence to show that offshore emissions indeed are lower.
Maybe add a little bit on this, because we did some research in the offshore of the Netherlands, and actually we hope to have a PhD student finishing this year, Geert de Bruin. And one of the things of offshore measurement of methane that you need a expensive ROV, and it just brings a measurement apparatus just to put it on top of what is leaking. But you only put it on top when it's leaking, and when you have a well which is on off, then you only put it on when it's leaking for only 1 minute or so, and then you extrapolate that to emission in a year. If you measure a longer time, then when the well is off, you also measure that. So that's my add to this.
That's interesting. I just wanted to, ask your opinion, Maria, and perhaps Vincent and Martin, what you think. We know that methane, for example, is methane reduction can have rapid impact on climate change compared to CO2 because it traps heat. It's 28 times more potent in trapping heat over a 100-year time scale. And what the EU Methane Emissions Regulation is doing is actually, I would say, quite novel with respect to some of the things you shared today. But what we expect is that other parts of the world, I know this is outside your presentation, I just want to ask you, other parts of the world would need to also do something similar so that the effort at least is equal, if you like, across the world. Because otherwise, this effort will be in vain if you were trying to do this within the EU and other parts of the world are a bit more, relaxed. So what do you think can be done or is being done currently to ensure some of the things you have within the EU regulation is replicated somehow around the world?
Very good question, but I think exactly the methane import standard is, let's say, response to that question. There was a recognition in the methane strategy and the early discussion on methane regulation that methane emissions in the EU have been decreasing since 1990s. Of course, the major source for decrease was the closure of coal mines, but nonetheless, those emissions were decreasing, and actually now agriculture is the major emission source. Why focus on energy sector? This is because, as per IEA analysis and other types of analysis, it is the most cost-effective to reduce those emissions because we have already, let's say, we know in principle, once those emissions are identified, we know how to mitigate them. Yeah. So I think that's the focus on energy. Now, apart from the import, and the logics behind the import standard is to ensure that apart from doing what we need to do in the EU, there is also requirement of the producers, because actually emissions from production account for majority of emissions from supply chains. Usually, of course, that will be different for some supply chains, but it is usually assumed that those emissions are the highest. So that's why, let's say, there is an effort to ensure that because we will still use gas and some fossil fuels for some in the future. There was, let's say, the thinking that we need to ensure that at least we minimize these methane emissions associated with production. Having said that, apart from that, European Commission, together with the US, launched the Global Methane Pledge at COP21 in Glasgow back in 2021. So now the initiative is supported by 160 countries, including the European Union. The idea is it is a collective pledge, collective target to reduce global methane emissions from all anthropogenic sources by 30% by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. And again, it is collective target and it's non-binding, so it's subject to different countries' efforts. But it looks like, and that was raised by the recent IEA methane tracker, that even countries that are not part of Global Methane Pledge, like China, actually are reducing their methane emissions. In case of China, the major source of emissions is coal mining sector. Right. And it looks like that China undertook the efforts to reduce those emissions mostly to, let's say, focus more on producing coal from less gassy coal mines, and also potentially apart from that, there are some further regulations that were introduced to reduce those emissions. So again, that's really interesting dynamics. Again, it's a collective effort. It's not binding, so many countries are not undertaking the effort. But it looks like some countries that are outside of the framework also undertake effort to reduce those emissions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. I wouldn't know if Vincent, PE, and Martin would like to say some last words before we wrap up.
No, well, I think my focus is really on wells, integrity, abandoned wells, etc. And I'm looking forward to, potentially us as a community, technical community, learning more about these wells and what a potentially more reasonable regulation could be. We haven't talked about the impact on the environment yet, but it has been the topic of a strong focus of research in the Netherlands, in Norway, for instance, to try to see how we can make a difference in what really matters. To have an impact on reducing emissions that actually matter. And the fact that the current regulation does not make a lot of distinction or did not consider recent science findings, maybe says that it's going to be tough to apply. And I look forward to some future discussions, maybe a revision at some point. So we didn't have to discuss LARP, Maria, but as low as reasonably practicable. We have to be pragmatic.
Yeah. I mean, I agree
any
with
comments?
you. Yeah, Martin.
No, I've not anything to add to this. There's a lot to digest. Not only from a geological point of view, but also from a regulation point of view. I mean, with all these new abbreviations we can add to our vocabulary. So thanks a lot, Maria, for trying to explain in half an hour the whole regulation, because it's enormous effort.
Thank you very much. And for me, it was a pleasure. And thank you very much for great questions that actually, also made me think about a couple of things. So that was really great.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much once again, Maria. Thank you, P. Vincent, and thank you, Martin. On this note, a very, very strong point from what P. Vincent said about environmental impact, very vital. I really look forward to a future event that's going to actually zero in on that, because there are 8 things like cumulative impact, indirect impact, irreversible impact of these actions that we need to look into. So I do agree with you, Vincent, that we've got to look at this at some point.
So Martin, without putting you on the spot, but are you working on the next event in Utrecht?
No, actually, we are looking for other volunteers, because our main sponsor said no, there was a once in a life.
Okay.
So
no, it was a fantastic.
And if you are interested in this symposium, everything is on our website. It's called nlog.nl. It stands for Netherlands Oil and Gas, but then nlog.nl. And then look at the methane. All the presentations are there, but not all and abstracts. So it's still there. So let's see.
Okay. I think on that note, we call it a wrap. Thank you once again, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
People ask me why they should join SPE, and what I tell them is that SPE is absolutely essential. Frankly, if SPE didn't exist, somebody would have to go out and create it. When you graduate with a technical degree, a petroleum engineering degree, or other engineering degree, you get a lot of really good knowledge that gets you started on your career, and you learn a lot on the job. But the jobs that we have in this industry, they're really quite difficult. And you've got to have other resources, either to solve specific problems you might be having at the moment, or to better understand how to solve, daily issues that you work on. SPE provides opportunities to learn about new things that people are working on. There are great articles in JPT Magazine and the other magazines that we have that are really useful. If you're not reading JPT every month, I tell you it's essential to do that to keep up with the technology. We have excellent conferences where you can learn from people who have solved very difficult problems in our industry. And doing that is just incredibly important and incredibly useful. To me, I don't see how you can be an engineer working in the petroleum industry and not find value in the resources and the opportunities that SPE provides. It's an opportunity to meet people who can help you in the industry, and it's an opportunity to get the knowledge you need to be successful.